Welcome to Kuwait's Industrial Automation and Control Systems Cybersecurity Conference, KIACS Cybersecurity 2014, 25 through 26 May 2014. Hosted and organized by Kuwait Petrochemical Company in partnership with KPC.
So our final presentation before the break is coming from Joel Langill, who is the ICS cybersecurity specialist at Infrastructure Defense Security Services, and here to talk on the subject of cybersecurity risks, Heartbleed, Open SSL, Vulnerability, and ICS. With over 30 years of experience, Joel is an expert, integrated ICS, functional safety and operational security. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, Joel Langill.
Right.
30 minutes.
30 minutes, I'll do it. So it's kind of funny, that's a long presentation title because it's kind of evolved over the planning phase of the event. But I'm going to talk kind of blending a lot of what people have been referring to date, because doing this for several years, a lot of people, until they see hard data, sometimes don't really accept how real this problem is. So we're going to take a look at some actual numbers, some actual dollar values, and then kind of dive at some of the current threats today. I did get an interesting take from Michael's first talk this morning about walking in and seeing systems that you're shocked at how people have installed equipment and never touched them. I installed hundreds of Cisco PIX 505 and 515 firewalls that, shockingly enough, I can visit a large percentage of those factories today, and that equipment's still there. That's the kind of awareness that we're trying to raise. Vulnerabilities aren't just a Windows problem. Vulnerabilities exist throughout the entire industrial architecture. And that's one reason that we need to start to make people aware that the whole threat, vulnerability, impact management associated with risk is really a very comprehensive problem. So the more we can learn, the more we can actually find out. Let's get in a slide advancement. We'll go past the title slide. The first thing that I want to help people understand is it's very important to qualify the data that you may hear people talk about. Now, I put the Verizon data breach report first, but understand there are several similar reports that companies like McAfee, Microsoft, Symantec, they all release on an annual basis. But you've got to understand, in general, they have very little realistic industrial data. Okay, so some of these sectors, like the electric utilities, are very high profile, so there may be very small percentages of data relating to that. But I'll never forget sitting at an industrial conference and a speaker came up and their entire talk was about the results of the Verizon data breach report. And of course, I knew that that really isn't our environment. So the data sources that I use to do my independent research and my analysis tends to come from three sources that provide you with a window into real industrial vulnerabilities and industrial incidents. The first one, of course, is something called the Open Source Vulnerability Database. I believe strongly in this project. This is actually an open source project. You buy subscriptions in order to do some advanced queries on the database. But they actually have a database that's far greater than anything else. Most people actually look at the National Vulnerability Database managed through NIST in the United States. But the Open Source Vulnerability Database, as I'm going to show you, has about 40%, or actually it has almost twice as many vulnerabilities that it tracks versus that you would see in the National Vulnerability Database. So obviously, here's vulnerabilities. That's great. Now we need to have some information about industrial vulnerabilities. So that's when I turn to the Industrial Control Systems CERT organization, which is under the US Department of Homeland Security, very closely coordinates with most of the global CERT organizations, whether it's QCERT or CPNI in the UK or Cybersecurity Malaysia. As we go around the world, these organizations very closely align. But the reason I work very closely with ICS CERT is because they now are focused on industrial control system security vulnerability disclosures. Now, it's got a government logo associated. The problem with that is that from that organization, you, as individuals, entities, owners in Kuwait, the GCC in general, are not going to receive any incident data. So vulnerabilities by themselves don't necessarily represent risk. What you're trying to understand is the vulnerabilities that have been successfully converted into real-world events. Okay, so we have our friend, the S word from 2010 that the world knows about. But are there more incidents that really didn't make it into the headlines? That's what we're going to take a look at. That's where I turn to an organization who our guest, Mr. Eric Byers, was one of the founding members of associating this database, which today it's now called RISC, or the Repository of Industrial Security Incidents. This is a purely paid service. You must pay to get the report, but this is a report that dives into the specific events related to industrial manufacturing operations. This is really the source that those of us that provide advice to customers really want to look at, because this is the only source that will provide you with breach data that's actually relevant to your particular environment. So let's take a look at some of these numbers and how they plan out. The first one is taking a look at SCADA, or Industrial Control Systems, DCS, PLC, so on, in the industrial or the open source vulnerability database. Pretty interesting curve. I put together this and I actually posted on an awareness website I have, which is kind of track these numbers since these ICS vulnerabilities have started to show up. And for roughly 10 years, nothing. It's a very, very flat curve. Lo and behold, 2010, bam. Of course, we all know what happened in 2010, was our good friend, the S guy. And now, from that point forward, we've gone from a 10 or 15 vulnerabilities a year to 170 to 200 vulnerabilities a year. Now, we have to take that data with a grain of salt, as we would say, using an English colloquialism. The problem is that it tends to be very slanted at what people are aware of. So there's this massive influx of security researchers that have never seen a PLC. So me, to show you I'm always passionate about this business, I'm one of the few guys that actually travels around with a PLC in my bag. I mean, this is what it's all about. It's not about Windows, it's about understanding these devices that we have in our plant, as well as got to have a handy-dandy industrial firewall to go with it. Of course, I dropped my remote. Thank goodness the batteries didn't fall out of it. But the idea here is that this database is now very much in play. So we've got vendors here today from Honeywell, from Siemens, from Emerson. What's really interesting is that when we look at those numbers, so in 2010, if we look at all of the industrial vulnerabilities that have occurred since then, more than 80% of the total to date have occurred since 2010. Now, what's really interesting is I kind of queried the numbers. So, Emerson, how many vulnerabilities from Emerson are in the database? The industrial side, 11. Honeywell's represented here. Honeywell has 1. Yokogawa is also a very strong supplier in the GCC region. They have 8. Now, I want to show you how media perception and people's awareness can skew databases. Now we talk Siemens AG. So in that listing of 558 industrial vulnerabilities, Siemens AG has 103 of them. Now I'm going to tell you right now, that does not mean that Siemens is by far the worst product in there. It's of course because in 2010, they happened to be the victim of that very disastrous malware. So it's not saying that a system made by ABB or a system made by General Electric or Honeywell or Emerson is any more or less secure. It's just the fact that people haven't even begun to look at them. So always take your data kind of in perspective. On the left, we see the type of vulnerabilities that we're starting to see in industrial, right? Now, what's very interesting is if you look at that 558 vulnerabilities that have been discovered in industrial control systems, very few of them actually target the embedded systems. So to me, as an independent researcher, that's where I become very aware. So let's flip this. I took a look at all those numbers. Now, the Industrial Control Systems CERT in the United States provides a yearly recap. So we take a look at the 2013 summary, and what's really interesting is that almost half of all the problems that we found last year focus on two very key areas: denial of service and authentication problems. Okay? So we know in industrial that denial of service is a significant event. Now, we don't like to use DOS when we talk about industrial systems. We think more of loss of control, loss of view, loss of operational integrity, right? So denial of service on a process controller will typically result in a process shutdown. And what's really bad is that in general, if you can do a loss of control of even a single controller in a large distributed control system, you can bring down significant parts of plants. So this is where we start to be very concerned, is that now, especially when we start talking about authentication, the one thing that we see that's very different from an IT point of view is that authentication within an industrial environment tends to allow you very wide access. So if you're able to compromise the authentication and the credentials of a single device, usually it can be reused against a very large pool of other subsequent devices. So that's the 2013 vulnerability review of about 175 or so that are to date. Now, let's go back and take a look at what's happened with those vulnerabilities. So RISI every year does this report, and what they do is they qualify the category of event. And some of those events they classify as significant, and other events they kind of consider as being secondary. The one thing that I stress over and over again when we try to compare IT and OT's worlds are those two topics that are shown in red: death. I haven't found one IT person that can show me a breach that's resulted in loss of life. Yet, if you look in the RISI database, there are roughly 5% of the total incidents that have occurred on industrial control systems and manufacturing environments have resulted in the loss of life of multiple people. This is serious. That's why I'm trying to get people to stop saying IT and OT, but I consider this operational security, not operational technology, because our simple little control system, though we would all agree they're not that simple, are actually responsible for controlling very serious pieces of mechanical equipment. And when things go wrong, it's not that you lose the ability to browse the internet or receive a timely email message. People can die. Now, let's put the dollars against that. In our database, you see that roughly a quarter of all of the cyber events that we've been tracking in industrial have resulted in an impact of greater than $1 million. Those are significant events. So we get into these discussions and we talk about what we're trying to do to get people to change. They kind of look at things and go, oh, that's too expensive. These numbers show that in our world, one of your oil refineries coming down for a day, and we all know that most refineries don't go down for one day because they're very difficult to start back up and they take time. We can easily assimilate millions of dollars in lost opportunity with very, very small cyber events. Now, I'm getting a little bit behind, so I'm going to go past this slide. What you will rarely see from people that don't look at this source of data is the enormous impact to your business. Most people are focusing on the critical infrastructure that's in the limelight, which would tend to be electric utilities and water and wastewater and finance and so on. Lo and behold, petroleum is one of the most costly impacted industries as a result of cyber events. And again, this is the perfect forum. I think you all realize that. So when I read the report that was published last week in Gulf Today about the GCC suffering billion-dollar a year losses due to cyber, it's very, very easy to see why. Okay? So what I wanted to do is I kind of wanted to get us into what's really going on today and this whole idea around Heartbleed. So Heartbleed comes out, and I actually have a very good friend that works for Demicon, which was one of the co-discoverers of the Heartbleed Open SSL vulnerability. We had a really interesting dialogue, and we talked about what this was. And you look at this vulnerability, it's with an open source library. So I'm kind of going, yeah, open source, that's great in the Internet of Things. But when we talk about the industrial of things, we don't tend to see it a lot. But now there's going to be some important words in here. It also contains a very valuable cryptographic library that starts to make me think this might start to show up. What this vulnerability was there's a heartbeat that occurs on these sessions, which is basically, hey, are you still there? And of course, there's a response that comes back. Well, they found a weakness that I could say, I want you to respond with this. And okay, the heartbeat was expecting to only send a very small response back, but they found that they could actually receive a chunk of memory. Okay? Well, now what became very clever was that you could subsequently do this and receive lots of chunks of data concurrently and start to recreate what's running in memory. Okay? So, notice I put potential in quotation marks. So the people that are very familiar with the internet, web services, banking, online business to business realize that if you look at a typical internet website, it's receiving thousands of authentications over a very short period of time. Millions, depending on the site. Take something like Google.com, where every Google session is now running through HTTPS. Every time you would look at memory, you had a very high probability of finding either the keys that were used to establish the session, the credentials that you supplied to provide your Google account, or the data that they were trying to encrypt in the first place. Okay, so everybody says the sky is falling, this is a problem. So I had a colleague of mine that has a media outlet call me one Friday night and said, I want to do a story on this. So I said, my gut feeling is it's not going to be a big deal. But what I did was I started to create a little objective profile here. A, platforms. In general, you can have a high confidence factor that you're going to find OpenSSL in the Unix variants versus Windows. So for those people that have launched websites and have chosen the IIS platform versus Apache, they're going to implement HTTPS without using OpenSSL. So you see these people that say there's a significant portion of the internet at risk. They're correct, because a large portion of the internet is run using the Linux versions in the Apache infrastructure. The next thing is this question of authentication versus encryption. This is where next week I'm going to be speaking at the DHS conference on this exact subject. This will cause a huge fight because most people do not understand that you can authenticate without using encryption. And we've got several vendors in here. The DCSs, for instance, have been doing authentication in their industrial communications for a very long time. The SCADA world, on the other hand, has not. The way that they tended to try to do their authentication was simply by adding encryption to the problem. So I'm looking at this. What's this going to tell me? It's going to start to allow me to put different people into different classes. But the issue here is who uses Linux or a variant thereof it, who uses a lot of encryption, and where would I see it? Bingo, the thing on the bottom. Where in an industrial control system am I going to start to see a lot of general purpose IT technologies? So sure enough, I've got a pretty nice test lab. So I go start pulling things out of my test lab. And the first thing I pull out, I have a very, very respected relationship with Siemens AG. We do a lot of work together. They just came out with a PLC, this S7 1500, the top picture, that has been truly designed for security. Lots of features in it. We won't get into that there. But sure enough, it's the first device I find vulnerable to Open SSL. I'm like, oh, great. Here goes the theory that it shouldn't be showing up in our world. So why did it show up? Because many people wanted web servers to run in their PLCs. So sure enough, there's an embedded web server, and unlike probably one of their larger competitors would be Rockwell Automation. Rockwell Automation does not provide the ability to encrypt their web server in their PLCs. Siemens does, so sure enough, the HTTPS infrastructure that's in this PLC was vulnerable. So luckily, as we started to review a lot of these systems, that was the only true industrial controller that we found had the problem. But let's go back to that general purpose IT. Where are we using that stuff all over our networks? For security, perimeter protection, remote access, and so on. This is where I got very concerned. And this is where other devices started to show up. So the first thing is there's a couple industrial firewalls that are made by a company, Anominate Technology. And they happen to have one that was running a vulnerable version of OpenSSL. And the main reason is that those industrial firewalls are managed using a very simple, in my opinion, insecure infrastructure, which is based on HTTPS. So sure enough, when we looked at those, there was a very limited window of OpenSSL versions that were vulnerable. We did find a few of these industrial firewalls that could be compromised. Now, the good thing, I'll save it for the next slide. The guy on the bottom you probably haven't seen. This is actually a hardware-based encryption device supplied by a company called Certes Networks that actually allows you to do hardware-based encryption, kind of like if you put in dedicated hardware. It allows you to do the encryption at various levels on the OSI stack. So it's more than just a VPN tunnel. It actually allows you to, for instance, encrypt the payload but not encrypt the header. So it becomes very useful when you want to run it through networks and maintain your quality of service configuration and so on. And sure enough, when I ran that through, bingo, I found another vulnerable device. Now the problem is with the Siemens guy on the top, the easiest thing is, do you really need HTTPS in the first place? Are you really using that web service? If not, just turn it off. It actually isn't on by default, so that was fairly easy. The guy on the bottom became very concerning because that is actually a device that once it's used, it will remain in. And it's not like you're accessing a web server on that. They're using the SSL infrastructure in order to manage the encryption. So what could the bad guy possibly do? So a couple of minutes ago, I talked about possible breaches. There are tools, and you could never read this from the audience, but it'll be in there. The tool on the right is an exploitation framework called Metasploit. They have a built-in module that would allow you to do a memory dump, which is what those two screens are. Now, I ran that 2 times in rapid succession, and you can see that memory is very dynamic. So I came back and went, bingo, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. Because think of our environments, the encryption and authentication that we do implement in these industrial environments, it's not like you have a lot of users that are logging in rapidly. They tend to log in, create a session, and that session remains intact for a very long time. So the actual information disclosure that we found was minimal. It wasn't the keys, and it wasn't the credentials. The only way you ever would have been able to get those two pieces of very important information would have been if you ran the exploit exactly when somebody was trying to authenticate. Now, the tool on the left just shows how rampant this thing became. That's a little Python script. Now, it was far more versatile than the Metasploit module because it allowed you to do a lot more adjustments. But again, like anything else, a vulnerability is disclosed, the exploitation software becomes obvious very fast. So what happened was there was a big push to start to identify if there were products that could be vulnerable. So the takeaway on this is if you're concerned, please contact your vendor. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security did create a spreadsheet that is updated regularly. The problem is there are some vendors, for very solid and sound reasons, have chosen not to put their information in that database. So just because you don't see your vendor in that database, don't think everything's okay. Please contact your vendors. Your key vendors, you know, your Honeywells and your Siemens and your Yokogawas. By the way, Siemens is in this list. So you would find the Siemens products, which is only really one that impacts industrial. But you won't necessarily see Yokogawa. You won't see ABB. There is one ABB product in there. So just the takeaway is make sure you contact your vendor. That's the URL to the spreadsheet link, which you can certainly find by going to the ICS CERT website. Now, as I end this, this is the thing that's most important. If you have XP running in your systems, in your industrial control systems today, everything I've said for the past 23 minutes is completely worthless. Your threat profile due to running Windows XP far exceeds anything that any of these very, very, very specific attacks, these very specific vulnerabilities would show. So, if you've inventoried your systems and you're still running XP, you got two choices. Put security around them to deal with it, or consider your migration plan to get off of it. Because right now, there are people that have collected the vulnerabilities for XP that they chose to never disclose. So the number of what we would call O days or 0 days for Windows XP is very high right now because everybody knew that Microsoft was going to withdraw support. So people wanted to have in their pocket the exploitability on this operating system that they knew wouldn't be patched. So that's why I kind of, there's so much more I would have liked to have said, but I do want to leave it for one or two questions of talking about vulnerability and threat understanding. Are there any questions? If not, I got more data I could say. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, question time. Your name, your company, and your question, please.
Jamal Al-Blushi from Petroleum Development Oman. I see that you talked about a lot of encryption devices. Now, it came to my mind that do we need encryption devices within layer 2 of the DCS, PLC, HMI?
Okay, that is a very good question, and I hope you all heard it. Do we really need encryption in layer 2 devices? I'm an oil guy. This is what I've done. Amit's got a patent in cybersecurity. My patent's actually in flare management. I did a lot with flare monitoring and control, so I actually have a patent on that. I believe no. There is no justified reason in most DCS environments to encrypt. And when we've done the mathematical modeling against it, it's not very feasible because we need very real-time control at that level. And today, with the current hardware technology, we can't encrypt and decrypt and still maintain that high-performant deterministic environment. So they're choosing to authenticate through alternate methods. And you can do that, right? Microsoft, if you've ever observed a Microsoft authentication session, they do authenticate without encrypting the communication session. Now, there is some encryption that occurs during the authentication step. But once the authentication occurs, everything goes back to clear text. So I believe that in the DCS world, where the majority of our traffic, and the 99+% is on local area networks, there's no reason to encrypt. The SCADA guys, however, have a different problem because they have a lot of data that needs to go over wide area shared networks. So they need to do something to protect their, not necessarily the confidentiality of the data, but to protect the integrity of the data. And again, most people take the easy way by using encryption to get the integrity factors as well, right? So again, they want to make sure that data can't change and that whatever you put on the wire shows up on the other end unchanged and the same. So the easiest way to do that is by encrypting the data. So that's why that SerDes device was really designed, was to handle that wide area network problem without having to build IPsec tunnels and so on. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, sorry. My name is Marcel. I am from KMPC, Kuwait National Petroleum Company. Regarding that Python script that you mentioned, it can be run on the Metasploit. Is there no way to make it run on the continuously?
Absolutely.
Because, yeah.
So just to clarify, the Metasploit uses Ruby. The Python script, you can just run at the command line of a Linux computer. Yes, you can run it continuously. And there's so much more I would like to talk about. That's what people do, is they actually run this concurrently, and they stream together the 64 KB blocks, and they actually can recreate what's going on and what's executing in memory. So yes, that is a concern.
Mohammed Saeed, Saudi Aramco. What do you think about multi-factor authentication, using it under or in the plant's network? For example, a process automation network or distributed control systems?
Okay, so the questions about multi-factor authentication. In the world of the layer 2 networks, different vendors call them different things. Again, I believe that there is not high value in multi-factor because you tend to be doing application to application or application to device authentication. There's no human in there. So the human authentication, as soon as we need the people factor, that's when the multi-factor comes in. So for instance, if you look at your control system and you use an engineering tool to download a change to a controller, in that case, it's the applications that are handling an authentication, and in general, they don't do it using a multi-factor base because there's really not a lot of value gained. Because what you're trying to prevent is impersonation. So doing multi-factor when it's still the application, you would really not buy a lot. So some companies choose that, by the way. They do that through a dongle. Okay, so it can be done through some external mechanism. But again, the tendency is not so much to use that as it is when we have the people side, where we want to make sure that the people in the computer are who they're supposed to be before they actually are granted access to the endpoint. Yeah.
Cool. Our last question coming up. Name, company, and your question, sir.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Karthikeyan from KIACS.
Okay.
We talked about encryption devices to be used in the SCADA system. What is the effect of latency of the encryption devices for the real-time SCADA operations?
That's a good question. So I'm at a conference, and we have somebody from academia present their encryption on real-time industrial protocols. And this professor, very smart man, said, we're only observing a 20% impact. Now, the control engineers busted out laughing. Okay? In real-time communications, which they're not used to in IT, we're real-time. We laughed. So we take a protocol like Modbus, which we know is a very vulnerable protocol, and it's also very inefficient. And add 20% on top of that, it's unacceptable. So that's why people are trying to do this using a different mechanism. So you brought up a good point. That's exactly why the first target that I went after Heartbleed came out was the new secure version of the Distributed Network Protocol, or DNP3. It's very, very heavily used in electric utilities, but there has been a lot of work done here in the GCC of the deployment of DNP in oil and gas. And of course, the main reason is DNP is a report by exception protocol. So their secure authentication standard actually has components that the vendors or the suppliers could use SSL to do it. They don't have to, but it's one of the options available. So that's again why we tend to not see the risk in industrial protocols in the DCS world is just making sure that the two endpoints are authenticated against each other. Once that occurs, they really don't care about the exchange of information as much. They just want to make sure that somebody didn't sneak on a network and is now going to start to send commands to a controller or try to reprogram a controller without the controller knowing that that other side is supposed to be there. So again, and of course at the break we can bring some of the vendors in and they could share what's available to share. But I'm not expecting to see in the DCS world between the operator stations and the controllers a lot of encryption. I think everybody's getting scared, so it's going to be asked for, and we have to wait and see how many people will actually use it. Because even with 100 meg and gigabit networks, real-time communications is actually, we're still very concerned on message delivery and making sure that things get there in a timely manner. So again, I'll be here all day. My plane's tomorrow, so we have all night too to talk if you want. But I do thank you all very much. I enjoy talking at these conferences.
Ladies and gentlemen, Joel Langill, thank you very much indeed. Talking on cybersecurity risks and Heartbleed indeed, Joel.
Hosted and organized by Equate Petrochemical Company in partnership with KPC.